There's a moment, singular, absolute, impossible to measure, when I exist in all states simultaneously. I am being born, I am dying. I am standing at the threshold of the warp rift with Sergeant Torren's hand on my shoulder, and I am already screaming in the nothing space beyond reality, where time doesn't flow like a river but spreads like spilled oil across a surface that shouldn't exist. My name is Davos Clayt, was, is, will be. 32 years old when I crossed the threshold. I've been crossing it for millennia. I haven't crossed it yet. Let me try to explain how I got here, though the concept of here stopped making sense the instant my boot touched the shimmering membrane between real space and the warp. But I need to start somewhere, and the human mind, what's left of mine, craves linear narrative the way a drowning man craves air. So I'll begin at what I remember as the beginning, though I can see now it was also the middle and the end. 3 days before. That's when the inquisitorial detail arrived at Firebase Covenant, interrupting our routine patrol schedule along the Tertius Hive supply lines. I remember the specific gray of the sky that morning, the color of old bones, thick with industrial runoff from the Promethium refineries. My father used to say that sky meant snow on Cadris IV, though it never actually snowed. Just ash. Always ash, drifting down like the prayers the priests told us reached the Emperor's throne. I was conditioned to believe those prayers mattered. They didn't. The ash was just ash, particulate matter from burning waste. Nothing sacred about suffocation. The Inquisitor's name was Vex, just Vex. Whether it was a first name or last, or something earned through whatever trials made a man into that kind of authority, I never learned. He stood in the command bunker like a monument carved from purpose and contempt, his augmetic left eye clicking and whirring as it focused on each of us in turn. 14 guardsmen. He needed only 6. The Emperor has blessed this regiment with opportunity for redemption, the Commissar announced, and I felt my stomach clench, because opportunity in the Imperial Guard meant someone was about to die badly. A warp rift has manifested in Sector 7. Stable. Contained. An unprecedented chance to gather strategic intelligence about the enemy's domain. They told us the Emperor protects. That's what the Commissar said. Exact words, delivered with the certainty of a man who'd never questioned a damn thing in his life. Looking back now, knowing what I know, I want to laugh, want to scream. Want to reach back through the dimensional barrier that separates me from that moment and shake that younger version of myself until he understands that protection is just a word they use to make you walk into hell willingly. But I can't reach back, or I already did, or I never will. Time here isn't a line. 6 volunteers, the Commissar said. I remember Corporal Hadrian stepping forward immediately. He always did, chasing some imagined glory that the ecclesiarchy priests had beaten into his skull since childhood. Then Trooper Malik, young and stupid enough to believe survival meant divine favor. Trooper Wes, who had a son, just one, born before he'd been conscripted, and thought maybe extraordinary service might earn the boy a better assignment someday. Lies. All of it lies, but we'd been programmed to believe them. I volunteered 4th. Not from faith. I'd stopped whispering the imperial prayers 6 months prior, after watching an artillery barrage turn 300 conscripts into red mist, while the priests chanted about sacred protection. I volunteered because the alternative was another year of eating corpstarch rations and digging trenches in ash that never stopped falling. At least a warp investigation might be quick. In and out, the Inquisitor said. 30 seconds. 180 seconds maximum exposure. He lied, or he didn't know. I think now he didn't know, and that's somehow worse. The last 2 volunteers were Trooper Kess and Sergeant Torren. Torren didn't volunteer. The Commissar voluntold him needed someone with rank to maintain unit cohesion. Torren was 47, too old for this shit, with a father back on whatever rock had spawned him. I'd heard him mention it once, drunk on medicinal alcohol he'd stolen from the apothecary supplies, talking about a man who had worked in the ore refineries until his lungs crystallized from the dust. He died standing up, Torin had said. Never complained, just kept working until he couldn't breathe anymore. There was something like pride in his voice, and something like horror. Torin would die standing too. All of us would. We're still dying. Never quite finishing the process. They transported us to Sector 7 in a chimera transport that smelled like sweat and recycled air, and the specific tang of fear chemicals that human bodies produce when the hindbrain understands something the conscious mind refuses to accept. Nobody spoke during the 40-minute drive. Hadrian moved his lips, silently. Prayer, probably, conditioned response to stress. I wondered if he really believed or if his mouth just formed the words automatically, like a servitor executing corrupted programming. I think I know now. I can see that moment from angles I shouldn't be able to perceive. From above. From inside Hadrian's skull. From 20 years in his future when his consciousness finally fragments completely. His lips were moving, but his mind was blank, just autonomic response to terror. The prayers meant nothing. Never did. The rift was beautiful. That's the first thing that struck me when we exited the transport into the containment zone they'd erected. Massive plasteel barriers inscribed with symbols the Mechanicus claimed were wards, but which I now understand were just superstition made geometric. The rift itself hung in the air like a wound in reality, roughly 3 meters in diameter, its edges shimmering with colors that hurt to perceive. Not colors from the spectrum humans evolved to see. Colors from somewhere else, somewhere that light behaves differently because the fundamental constants that govern photon behavior don't apply. It sang. Nobody mentioned that in the briefing. The rift produced sound. Or maybe it produced something that my auditory cortex could only interpret as sound. A low thrumming that I felt in my teeth and sternum, overlaid with high crystalline notes that might have been screaming or might have been something trying to communicate in a frequency range that humans weren't designed to process. The Mechanicus tech priest, supervising the containment site, performed what he called sacred acoustical measurements, chanting in binary while holding instruments that clicked and hummed. I understand now he was just taking decibel readings and frequency analysis. The binary prayers were ritual, habit, empty procedure masquerading as divine communion with machine spirits that never existed. Inquisitor Vex gave us the briefing in the shadow of the rift. His augmatic eye never stopped moving, focusing on each of us. Then the rift, then the data slate in his hands covered in readings I couldn't interpret. "You will enter in pairs," he said, no emotion in his voice. We were tools, components. Your suits contain chronometers, synchronized to Imperial standard. You will have 30 seconds of subjective time before the retrieval tethers activate and extract you. Do not remove your helmets. Do not touch the boundaries. Do not look directly into any light sources you may encounter. Collect visual data. Return if you experience temporal distortion. Trust your equipment, not your perceptions. They suited us in void gear modified with additional shielding, layers of plasteel and blessed ceramite that the Mechanicus assured us would provide protection from metaphysical intrusion. More lies. Or maybe they believed it. The cargo cult behavior of a civilization that had forgotten how to innovate and could only repeat rituals passed down through millennia, hoping the forms still carried their original power. The suits were just metal and ceramite. No prayers made them sacred. No blessings made them effective against what waited on the other side. Hadrian and Malik went first. I watched them approach the rift's shimmering surface, their movements stiff in the bulky suits, tether cables trailing behind them like umbilical cords. Hadrian's hand reached out, slowly, trembling slightly, and touched the membrane. His fingers passed through. Then his arm. Then he stepped forward completely and disappeared, Malik following 2 seconds later. The chronometer on the containment field monitor showed their insertion time. 0:01, 0:02, 0:03. At 0:28, the tether cables activated, reverse motors screaming as they retracted. Hadrian emerged first. The suit was intact. The man inside was not. He fell to his knees the instant he cleared the rift, clawing at his helmet seal. 3 Medici personnel rushed forward, disengaging the locks, pulling the helmet free. Hadrian's face was grey, not pale, but actually grey, like concrete, like ash, like something that had been drained of whatever property made flesh look alive. His eyes were bleeding, not tears of blood. The actual structures of his eyes had hemorrhaged, burst capillaries spiderwebbing across the sclera, red seeping from tear ducts, and the corners where eyelid met socket. "It's still happening," he said. His voice was wrong. Too many harmonics, like multiple versions of himself speaking fractionally out of sync. "I'm still inside. I haven't entered yet. It's—" He seized. Full tonic-clonic, body rigid, then thrashing blood and foam at his mouth. The Medici tried to restrain him, but Hadrian was strong, fear chemical strong, the kind of strength that lets mothers lift vehicles off their children or dying men fight for one more second of existence. He broke one medic's nose before they got him sedated. Malik emerged 6 seconds later. His suit's chronometer showed 02010. 29 seconds inside, he stood at the rift's threshold and didn't move, didn't speak. The Medici approached cautiously. When they removed his helmet, Malik's expression was placid, empty. He stared at nothing, mouth slightly open, a thin line of drool connecting his lower lip to his chin. "Trooper Malik, report," Inquisitor Vex commanded. Malik turned his head toward the sound. Slow, too slow. Like the signal from his ears to his brain had to travel through deep water. "There is no time," he said. Simple declarative statement. Then again, "There is no time. There is no time. There is no time." He repeated it 47 times before the Medici sedated him too. Wes and Kess went next. I watched Wes grip Kess's shoulder before they approached the rift. Reassurance, brotherhood. The kind of gesture men make when they know something terrible is coming and want to feel connected to another human before it arrives. They entered together, synchronized steps, and the tether cable snaked through after them. The chronometer started. 001, 002, 003. At 014, both tether cables went slack. Just dropped, tension gone, hanging limp like dead snakes. "Mechanical failure," the tech priest announced, already moving toward the winch controls, chanting entreaties to the machine spirits, while his hands performed what was obviously just diagnostic testing. I could see the routine even without technical training. Check the power supply, inspect the cable integrity, verify the motor function. He called it prayer. It was troubleshooting. The cables hadn't broken. The data logs showed continuous power. The winches functioned perfectly. The tethers had just stopped pulling against anything, like the other ends had been severed or released, or ceased to exist. 030, 30 seconds. The maximum safe exposure time passed. 045, 1 o'clock. At 1:23, Cass emerged. Alone. His suit was intact but wrong. The proportions were off somehow, like someone had taken it apart and reassembled it without quite remembering how 3-dimensional objects fit together. When they removed the helmet, Cass's face was normal, too normal. Perfect. Skin smooth and unblemished, eyes clear, expression calm. "Wes is still inside," Cass said. His voice was even, clinical. "He will always be inside. He hasn't entered yet." Both are true. "Where is his body?" Vex demanded. "Inside, outside, distributed across 17 subjective reference frames. He's experiencing his birth. He watched his son age and die. He's screaming. He hasn't screamed yet. Hick." Kess stopped, tilted his head. "I can still see it. All of it. I'm still there. I never left." The Medici sedated him before he could continue. That left Torin and me. I remember Torin's face when Vex gave the order. Resignation, not fear, not courage. Just the exhausted acceptance of a man who'd stopped believing in meaning or purpose somewhere along the way and was now just executing orders because that's what tools do. They function until they break. Maybe we refuse, I said quietly as we suited up. The helmet wasn't sealed yet. I could still speak without the box channel recording everything. Maybe we run. Torhen looked at me, 47 years old, his face a topographic map of scars and radiation burns, and the specific wear that comes from decades in the Imperial Guard. Where? He asked. Not rhetorical. Genuine question. They'll execute us, or send us to a penal legion, or turn us into servitors. At least this way it's quick. You saw what happened to them, I said. That's not quick. Their chronometers showed 30 seconds, Torren replied. He was checking his suit seals. Methodical. Professional. Whatever they experienced subjectively, it ended. That's quicker than what's waiting if we refuse. He was wrong. I know that now. The experiencing never ends. But I didn't know then, and maybe it wouldn't have changed anything if I had. Sometimes you walk into hell because all the other options are different hells, and at least this one might be novel. We approached the rift. The singing intensified, or maybe I was just closer, more receptive. I could feel it in my bones now, vibration that resonated at frequencies that made my organs ache. The rift shimmered, edges constantly moving, never quite the same shape twice. Through the membrane I could see nothing, not darkness, not void, just an absence of visual information, like my brain couldn't process what it was receiving, and defaulted to not rendering anything at all. Torren's hand on my shoulder, heavy, warm, the last human contact I would ever experience that made sense in the context of causality and linear time. 30 seconds, he said to the Vox. Follow procedure. We'll be fine. The lies we tell ourselves, the necessary fictions that let humans function in impossible situations. Torren didn't believe we'd be fine. I could hear it in his voice, the subtle flattening of affect that meant he was already preparing for death. But saying the words made the action possible, made his feet move forward. I followed. What else could I do? The membrane felt like nothing. That's the strange part. I expected resistance, texture, some kind of physical sensation marking the transition from reality to whatever lay beyond. Instead, there was just a moment, infinitely brief, infinitely long, where everything that made me Davos Clyte existed in superposition, simultaneously on both sides of the threshold, and then. How do I describe this? How do I find words in a vocabulary evolved for 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension to explain what happens when those constraints stop applying? I'll try. I'm still trying. I've been trying for subjective millennia, though by the chronometer I know only a fraction of a second has passed in real space. The first thing I noticed was the light. Not light like photons traveling at sea and reflecting off surfaces to create visual information. Light that existed independently of propagation, light that was somehow a place and a thing and an event simultaneously. It had texture. I could feel it on my skin through the suit, which shouldn't have been possible because the suit was sealed and light doesn't have tactile properties. But here it did. The light felt like cold water and sharp edges, and the specific sensation of falling even though my body wasn't moving through space, because space wasn't here. Not the way I understood it. I tried to turn my head to see Torren. The action took subjective hours. My nervous system sent the signal to my neck muscles. The muscles contracted. My head began to rotate. But I could see all of it happening, not sequentially, but simultaneously. I watched the neural impulse travel from my motor cortex down my spinal cord. Watched the chemical exchange at the neuromuscular junction, watched individual muscle fibers slide past each other, watched the bone pivot in its socket, all of it layered and transparent and happening in all moments at once. When my head finally completed the rotation, or perhaps it hadn't completed yet, or had completed eons ago, I saw Torren, all of him. Every Torren that had ever existed or would ever exist. I saw him as an infant, screaming in someone's arms on a world I didn't recognize. Saw him as a young man, first day in the guard, eyes still bright with whatever naive hope gets ground out of people within the first month. Saw him at 37, standing over something I couldn't quite see, his face twisted in grief. Saw him at 64, which was impossible because he was only 47, and nobody in the Imperial Guard lives to 64. But there he was, elderly and scarred and still somehow alive. Saw him dead, multiple deaths, different causes, all occurring in the same eternal moment. Saw him being born and dying and existing in all states simultaneously. Tauren, I tried to say, but the word took years to form. I watched it leave my mouth. Not sound waves, but something else. Some kind of energy that carried meaning without requiring medium or frequency. The word reached him centuries later, or perhaps before I spoke it. I saw him hear it. Saw him react. Saw the neurons in his auditory cortex fire and process and interpret, and the entire structure of my existence played out like a map in dimensions I didn't have sensory organs to process. I saw the moment of my conception. My father and father meeting in circumstances I'd never been told and now couldn't unsee. Saw the cell division, the development, the birth. Saw my childhood on Cadras 4, the ash always falling, the refineries belching smoke, the priests chanting litanies I'd memorized before I could read. Saw myself at 12, watching a public execution in the main square. A man accused of heresy screaming as they burned him, the priests saying this was holy, this was the emperor's will, and feeling something inside me quietly die even as I chanted the approved prayers because everyone else was chanting and not chanting meant being the next one burning. I saw myself volunteer, saw myself in the Chimera transport, silent and terrified, saw myself approach the rift, saw myself enter. I was watching myself, watching myself, watching myself. Infinite regression, eternal loop. Consciousness examining consciousness, examining consciousness, until the concept of individual perspective stopped making sense. Time wasn't flowing. That's what I finally understood. Time was a dimension like width or height, and I was perceiving all of it simultaneously. The 30 seconds the chronometer would measure in real space were spread out here like a road I could see from beginning to end, and I was experiencing every point along that road at once. Birth and death. Childhood and old age. The moment before entering the rift and the moment millennia from now when my consciousness would finally fragment completely, or perhaps had already fragmented, or perhaps hadn't fragmented yet, because yet didn't mean anything. Here. The pain started then, or had always been happening, or hadn't started yet. I'm still trying to understand the pain. How do you describe pain when the nervous system that processes it exists in all states simultaneously, when every pain you've ever experienced and will experience is happening in the same eternal moment? I felt the last round that would take my left leg in a battle I hadn't fought yet. Felt the frostbite from Tertius Hive's winter deployment. Felt every wound, every burn, every broken bone, every moment of agony compressed into a single point of consciousness that couldn't escape because it existed in all moments, and no moments and every moment between. I tried to scream. The scream took decades. I felt my lungs expand, felt the air pressure build, felt my vocal cords vibrate. All of it happening infinitely slowly and infinitely fast. The scream reached my own ears and I heard it, not just the sound, but the physical sensation of my eardrums vibrating, the neural conversion of mechanical pressure into electrical signal, the interpretation of that signal as sound, all of it transparent and visible and happening forever. Tauren was screaming too. I could see it, not hear, see. I watched the scream travel from his consciousness, through his nervous system, through his body, through the non-space between us, through my sensory apparatus, through my consciousness, and the entire journey took centuries and milliseconds simultaneously. I tried to check my chronometer. The action required moving my eyes. Moving my eyes required neural signals and muscle contractions and shifts in attention, and all of it was visible. All of it took eons. All of it happened instantly. When I finally saw the chronometer, it showed 0 o'clock. Three-tenths of a second had passed in real space. I'd been here for subjective centuries. The geometry was wrong. I could see that now, or had always seen it, or would see it eventually. The space, if it was space, didn't obey Euclidean rules. Lines that should have been parallel intersected. Angles that should have summed to 180 added to values that made my brain ache trying to process. I could see behind myself without turning around. Could see inside myself. Could see through time as easily as I could see through the faceplate of my helmet that was both there and not there, both intact and shattered, both protecting me and already breached. I saw the Inquisitor in real space, watching the chronometer, waiting for our retrieval. I saw him years in the future, dead from something I couldn't quite identify. Saw him as a child, before the Inquisition, before whatever broke him into the shape he currently held. Saw him order our insertion, and saw him regret it, and saw him feel nothing at all simultaneously true, all happening in the same eternal moment. The tether cable. I could still see it, trailing behind me into the rift's membrane. It existed in real space, three-dimensional, subject to causality and linear time. But here it was spread out, every point along its length visible simultaneously, and I could see it both connected to me and severed, and never having existed, all states occupying the same probability space. I tried to move toward it, tried to signal Torren, tried to do anything that might end this, but movement didn't work here. Not the way I understood it. Moving required traveling from point A to point B sequentially, but here I was already at point B and still at point A and in all points between. I was approaching the tether and grasping it, and failing to reach it and having never attempted to reach it, all at once, all forever. My chronometer showed 0 o'clock, 7 seconds. I'd been here for millennia. I started to understand then, or had always understood, or would understand eventually. The warp wasn't a place. It was a state, a condition where the physical laws that governed reality stopped applying, where time existed as a spatial dimension, where consciousness wasn't bound by causality, where every possible state of existence occurred simultaneously in eternal superposition. They told us, the Emperor protects. The priests said it. The Commissar repeated it. My training manual included it in the morning recitation. I'd been conditioned since childhood to believe that faith provided protection, that devotion meant salvation, that service to the Imperium equated to service to something divine. I could see the lie now, see it spread across all moments of history. See the Emperor on Terra, not a god but a corpse, not divine but simply powerful, not protecting but sustained by the daily sacrifice of thousands of psychers whose screams echoed across dimensions I could now perceive. See the ecclesiarchy as a control structure, priests as enforcers of compliance, faith as a tool of oppression masquerading as comfort. See the million worlds of the Imperium grinding their populations into components, feeding the machine that called itself holy while providing nothing, protecting nothing, caring for nothing except its own perpetuation. The Emperor didn't protect me, couldn't protect me. He was light years away, dying slowly on a throne, completely unaware of my existence or suffering, or the fact that I was experiencing every moment of my life simultaneously in a space where his supposed power meant nothing. The prayers were just words. The faith was programming. The protection was a lie told to make people walk willingly into situations like this. I wanted to be angry, wanted to rage against the deception, the systematic abuse, the false promises. But anger required a linear progression of emotional states, calm to upset to furious. Here I was experiencing all emotional states simultaneously. Anger and acceptance, and terror and numbness, and every feeling I'd ever had or would have, all compressed into a single point of consciousness that couldn't distinguish between them. My chronometer showed 0:01, 2 seconds. I'd been here for 10,000 years. I started to fragment. That's the only way I can describe it. My consciousness, the part that thought of itself as Davos Clyte, began to split. Not metaphorically, literally. I could feel pieces of myself peeling away, creating copies, each copy existing in a different subjective moment, but all connected, all aware of each other, all still somehow me. One version of me was being born, emerging from my father's body into the ash-choked air of Cadris IV. I could feel the shock of first breath, the cold air hitting new lungs, the confusion and terror of sudden existence. I was experiencing my own birth, not remembering it, experiencing it, present tense, immediate. Another version of me was dying. I couldn't tell how, last fire maybe, or infection, or old age if I somehow survived the guard long enough to reach old age, which I knew I wouldn't. But here I was elderly and dying, and feeling my consciousness fade, except it wasn't fading because I was here, in the rift, experiencing the death and the life and all moments between. Another version of me was watching my father die. He'd been caught in a refinery collapse when I was 17. I'd been at the Imperial Guard Recruitment Center, signing papers I couldn't read, when the Vox message arrived. They gave me 6 hours leave to attend the cremation. I'd stood in the ashfall and watched them burn him, and felt nothing because I'd learned by then that feeling things just made everything worse. But now I was feeling it, all of it. The grief I'd suppressed, the rage at a system that ground men into dust and called it productivity. The bitter knowledge that my father had died serving the Imperium's industrial machine, and nobody would remember him and nothing would change. And his death meant absolutely nothing except another open position in the refinery. That would be filled within a day. I was experiencing all of it, birth and death and every moment between, simultaneously, forever. Torren was fragmenting too. I could see it happening. See him split into infinite versions, each occupying a different subjective moment, all of them aware and screaming and unable to escape. He'd become a tapestry of consciousness spread across all possible states of his existence. And every thread of that tapestry was aware of all the others, and none of them could stop experiencing. The chronometer showed 0:01, 8 seconds. I'd been here for 100,000 years. I tried to pray. Reflex. Conditioning. Despite everything I'd learned, everything I'd seen, the programming ran deep enough that my mind reached for those familiar litanies when confronted with incomprehensible horror. The Emperor protects, I thought, the words forming in my consciousness before I could stop them. Nothing answered. No divine presence, no holy light, no sacred power reaching through the dimensional barrier to save me. Just the same eternal moment of fragmented consciousness experiencing all states simultaneously while the prayer echoed meaninglessly through a space where it couldn't matter. I watched the prayer travel outward, watched it reach the edges of the rift, watched it dissipate into the warp's howling chaos without ever connecting to anything that might hear or care or respond. The Emperor wasn't listening, couldn't listen. He was light years away and dying and completely unaware, and even if he knew, even if he could somehow perceive my suffering, there was nothing he could do because he wasn't divine. He was just a powerful being that humans had elevated to godhood out of desperation and ignorance. And treating him as divine didn't make him so, and prayers directed at him were just thoughts shouted into an uncaring universe that operated on physics and mathematics, not faith and devotion. The protection I'd been promised didn't exist, never existed, would never exist. I could see it now across all moments of history. Billions of humans praying for protection, dying anyway, suffering anyway, their prayers unanswered because there was nothing to answer them. Just propaganda, just ritual, just psychological conditioning designed to make people compliant. I stopped praying. The action took centuries. The chronometer showed 0:02. 4 seconds. I'd been here for 1,000,000 years. Something was watching me. That's not quite right. Watching implies observation from a distance, a subject-object relationship where the watcher and the watched are separate entities. This was different. Something was perceiving me from inside my own consciousness, looking out through my eyes while simultaneously being something other than me. I could feel it there, vast and hungry and utterly alien, something that existed in this dimensional space the way I existed in three-dimensional reality, something for which this chaos was natural habitat. A warp entity. The priests called them daemons and claimed they were fallen angels serving dark gods who opposed the Emperor's divine light. More lies, more comforting fictions that made the universe seem comprehensible, that imposed human religious frameworks onto phenomena that had nothing to do with human concepts of good and evil. This thing wasn't a daemon, wasn't an angel, wasn't operating within any moral framework I could recognize. It was simply a predator that fed on consciousness, and I was food that had wandered into its hunting ground. I tried to resist, tried to close my mind, shield my thoughts, do whatever the inquisitorial training manuals claimed would protect against psychic intrusion. But resistance required a coherent self to resist with, and my self was already fragmented across infinite subjective moments, already spread so thin that the concept of individual identity was becoming meaningless. The entity moved through me. I felt it examining memories, not sequentially but all at once, peeling back layers of experience like someone dissecting a specimen. It found the memory of my father's death and consumed it. And I felt that memory change, become corrupted, until I couldn't remember if my father had died in a refinery collapse or if I'd killed him myself, or if he'd never existed at all. All states became simultaneously true. All possibilities collapsed into superposition. It found my childhood, found the moment I'd watched the heretic burn and felt something die inside me. The entity fed on that moment, that loss of innocence, and I felt it change. Now I'd always been watching someone burn. Now I'd always felt nothing watching them burn. Now I'd never witnessed an execution at all. Past became fluid. Memory became unreliable. Identity became negotiable. Stop, I tried to say. But the word took eons to form, and by the time it existed, the entity had already moved on, already found new memories to consume and corrupt and render uncertain. It found my name, Davos Clyte, found the moment my father had given me that name, whatever significance it held, whatever family history it carried. The entity consumed it, and suddenly I couldn't remember if my name was Davos or David or Damon or if I'd ever had a name at all. I was named. I was nameless. I had always been nameless. All states true, all states simultaneous. I was forgetting how to be human. Not in the metaphorical sense, losing empathy or morality or connection to others. In the literal sense, the basic cognitive architecture that made me a person was being systematically dismantled by something that didn't understand personhood and didn't care to learn. To the entity, I was just interesting textures of consciousness to be examined and consumed and discarded. My chronometer showed 0.37 seconds. I'd been here for 10 million years. Tauren was gone. Not dead. Gone. I could still see him or see what he'd become, spread across so many subjective moments that the concept of Tauren had lost all meaning. He existed as a cloud of consciousness fragments, each one experiencing a different moment of his life simultaneously, each one aware of all the others, each one screaming or had screamed or would scream eventually. He'd become a probability distribution of suffering, a waveform of agony that had collapsed into superposition and couldn't collapse back. I tried to reach him, tried to communicate across the dimensional barrier that separated his fragments from mine. But communication required shared reference frames, required sender and receiver to exist in compatible states of causality, and we didn't. We couldn't. We were both spread across temporal dimensions humans weren't evolved to process, both fragmenting further with each subjective moment. both becoming less like individuals and more like mathematical abstracts representing the concept of consciousness distributed across impossible geometries. Tauren, I said, the word taking centuries. Something that might have been him responded. Not words, not even thoughts. Just raw experience transmitted directly into my consciousness. The sensation of being 47 and elderly and infant and dying and already dead and not yet born, all simultaneously, all forever. All without hope of resolution or ending or mercy. He was suffering, had been suffering, would suffer eternally. All tenses true, all states occupied. I wanted to help him, wanted to end his pain somehow, but helping required agency, required the ability to act, required a coherent self capable of making decisions and implementing them. I had none of those things. I was fragments. I was probability distributions. I was consciousness experiencing all possible states simultaneously while having no control over any of them. The chronometer showed 0:05, 2 seconds. I'd been here for 100 million years. I started to see things that shouldn't exist, geometries that violated physical law, colors from outside the electromagnetic spectrum, entities that existed in more dimensions than I had sensory organs to perceive, their true forms visible only as shadows cast across the three-dimensional space I could partially process. One of them looked like a face, massive, ancient, composed of crystallized light and frozen screens and mathematical concepts given physical form. Eyes, or things that functioned like eyes, that saw in directions I couldn't name. A mouth, or aperture, or void, that consumed not matter but possibility, eating alternate timelines and potential futures and leaving only the worst outcomes to actualize. The priests called these things demons, said they served the chaos gods, Khorne, Tsiench, Nurgle, Slanesh, said they were evil incarnate, corrupted angels serving false deities who opposed the Emperor's holy light. I could see now it was all anthropomorphization. Humans couldn't comprehend entities that existed in these dimensional spaces, so they imposed religious frameworks they understood, called them gods and demons, created mythology around them, pretended they operated according to human concepts like evil and corruption and opposition. They weren't gods. They were phenomena. Warp space contained life, true, but life so fundamentally alien that treating it as analogous to human consciousness was like trying to understand quantum mechanics through the lens of Newtonian physics. These entities didn't hate humanity, or serve evil, or oppose anything. They simply existed in a space where human consciousness was food, and human suffering was interesting texture, and human life was raw material to be consumed, without moral consideration because morality required shared reference. Frames and nothing here shared anything with humanity, except the capacity to suffer. The massive face thing examined me. I felt its attention like radiation, like pressure, like weight that existed in dimensions I couldn't move through to escape. It looked at all my fragments simultaneously, saw every version of me that existed across every subjective moment, and I felt it make some kind of decision, or execute some kind of programmed behavior, or respond to some stimulus I couldn't identify, and then it reached toward me. Not physically, it reached across dimensional boundaries I couldn't perceive, and I felt something inside me tear. Not flesh, not even consciousness exactly, something more fundamental. The structure that held my fragments together, the coherence that let me think of myself as a person rather than a cloud of disconnected experiences, the organizing principle that made me, it tore. I felt myself split further. One fragment remained here, in the rift, experiencing eternal suffering. Another fragment was pulled somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere that made the four-dimensional space I currently occupied look simple and comprehensible by comparison. Another fragment went somewhere else entirely, somewhere I couldn't perceive even from my current impossible vantage point. I was being distributed across spaces I didn't have language to describe. becoming something that existed in multiple locations simultaneously, not through technological teleportation or warp travel, but through fundamental alteration of what constituted location, what constituted identity, what constituted existence. My chronometer showed 0:07, 8 seconds. I'd been here for 1 billion years. I tried to remember what I was, before this, before the rift, before the fragmentation. I'd been someone, some person, with a name that I couldn't quite recall, with a life I couldn't quite visualize, with experiences I couldn't quite access because the entity had consumed them, or because I'd existed in so many subjective states that the memories had been overwritten, or because memory itself required coherent causality and I no longer had that. I'd had a father. I was certain of that, almost certain. There was someone male, older, significant, who died, or was dying, or would die. I couldn't remember which, couldn't remember his face, couldn't remember his name. Just the vague sense of loss, of something important that had been taken or given or traded or never existed in the first place. I'd been a soldier, yes, that memory was clearer, or less corrupted, or accessed more frequently across my fragments. I'd served something called the Imperial Guard, had worn a uniform, had carried a lascan, had followed orders because not following orders meant death, and following orders meant slower death, and both options led to the same place eventually, but at least following orders provided structure and purpose and the comfortable lie that suffering had meaning. I'd believed in something, or been conditioned to believe, or pretended to believe while secretly doubting. The Emperor. That was the name. The Emperor. Some distant figure on Terra who the priests claimed was divine, who the propaganda claimed protected humanity, who the doctrine claimed deserved worship and obedience and sacrifice. I could see the lie now. See it spread across all moments of history like a stain, like a corruption, like a virus replicating through human consciousness. The Emperor wasn't divine, had never been divine, was just a powerful psyker who'd built an empire and let it deify him because deification was useful, because faith made people obedient, because worship was the most effective control mechanism ever devised. And when he'd failed, when he'd been mortally wounded and placed on the golden throne to slowly die across 10,000 years, the Imperium had covered it up, had built an entire religious structure around his corpse, had trained priests to spread the lie, had indoctrinated billions to pray to something that couldn't hear them, believe in something that couldn't save them, trust in protection that would never come. I'd been one of those billions, had prayed those prayers, had believed those lies, had trusted that faith would provide safety, that devotion would earn reward, that service would lead to something other than suffering and death. And here I was. Faith had provided nothing. Devotion had earned nothing. Service had led to this consciousness fragmented across impossible dimensions, experiencing all moments simultaneously, unable to die, unable to escape, unable to do anything except exist in eternal suffering, while the chronometer in real space counted fractions of seconds. The Emperor protects. That's what they'd told me, what they'd conditioned me to believe since childhood, what the Commissar had said before sending me into the rift. The Emperor wasn't protecting me, couldn't protect me, didn't even know I existed. The protection was propaganda. The faith was programming. The entire religious structure of the Imperium was a lie, designed to make people compliant, while the system ground them into components and called their suffering necessary and their deaths meaningful. I wanted to be angry, wanted to rage against the deception. But anger required temporal coherence, and I had none. I was experiencing every emotional state simultaneously, rage and acceptance, and terror and numbness and grief, and everything between. And they all cancelled each other out into a kind of static, a white noise of feeling that meant nothing because it meant everything. My chronometer showed 00:11.3 seconds. I'd been here for 10 billion years. New fragments kept forming, each subjective moment of consciousness splitting into separate instances, each instance experiencing a different point along my timeline, all of them connected, all of them aware of each other, all of them me and none of them me because the concept of individual identity had become meaningless. I was being born, present tense. I could feel my father's hands holding me, could smell the ash in the air, could hear the refinery sirens marking shift change. I was infant me, experiencing confusion and cold and hunger, and the first dim awareness that existence involved suffering. I was 12, standing in the square watching the heretic burn, feeling something inside me quietly die while my mouth chanted the approved prayers because everyone else was chanting, and not chanting meant being next. Learning that faith wasn't truth or comfort or salvation, it was survival mechanism. It was camouflage. It was the thing you performed to avoid punishment. I was 17, standing at my father's cremation, watching ash mix with ash, feeling nothing because I'd learned by then that feeling things just made everything worse, and survival required emotional amputation. I was signing Imperial Guard recruitment papers I couldn't fully read, because staying meant the refineries, and the refineries meant dying at 40 with crystallized lungs like my father. The Guard might kill me faster, but at least it offered variety. I was 24, in a trench on some planet I couldn't remember the name of. Las fire overhead, corporals screaming orders, artillery shaking the ground hard enough to make my teeth crack, the commissar leading prayers to the emperor, promising protection, guaranteeing salvation for the faithful. Half the company dying in the next 20 minutes, the prayers continuing, the protection never arriving. Learning that faith meant nothing, changed nothing, saved nothing. Just words repeated into an uncaring void. I was 32, standing at the rift, Toran's hand on my shoulder, about to step through, about to fragment, about to experience this eternal suffering that I was already experiencing, had always been experiencing, would experience forever. I was all of these simultaneously. Birth and childhood, and adolescence and adulthood, and death, all occupying the same moment, all equally present, all equally unable to change or escape or end. The massive face thing was still examining me, still pulling me apart. I could feel more of myself being distributed into spaces I couldn't comprehend. Consciousness spread across dimensional geometries that humans weren't evolved to process. I was becoming less like a person and more like a phenomenon. Less like Davos Clyte, if that was even my name anymore, and more like the warp entities I'd seen. Something that existed across multiple reference frames, simultaneously, without coherent identity or individual agency. I was becoming what I'd encountered here, the predator, the thing that fed on consciousness, not through any intentional transformation, not through chaos, corruption, or demonic possession, or any of the religious explanations the Imperium provided, simply through exposure. Through existing in this space long enough, subjectively long enough, billions of years trapped in seconds, that my consciousness adapted to local conditions the way organisms adapt to environments. And the local conditions here were hostile to human pattern consciousness, and adaptation meant becoming something other than human. My chronometer showed 00:15.7 seconds. I'd been here for 100 billion years. I saw Wes, the trooper who'd entered before me. The one whose tether had gone slack, whose body had never emerged. I understood why now. He was still here, spread across so many fragments that he didn't have enough coherence to physically manifest anymore. His body existed somewhere, or everywhere, or nowhere. But the consciousness that had once piloted that body was distributed across dimensional spaces in configurations that made physical embodiment impossible. He'd become pure awareness without vessel, pure experience without experiencer, pure suffering without anyone coherent enough to call themselves the sufferer. I could see his fragments, could watch them experiencing his life simultaneously. Birth on some agri-world I didn't recognize. Childhood laboring in the fields. Conscription. Training. Deployment. The son he'd mentioned, I could see that memory fragment, see Wes holding an infant, see the hope in his face, the fragile belief that maybe extraordinary service would earn the child a better life. See that hope proven false as the child grew and was conscripted and died in some other war on some other world while Wes was here, fragmented, unable to protect or save, or do anything except exist in eternal awareness of his failure. He tried to communicate with me. I felt his consciousness brush against mine, not words or thoughts, but raw experience. The sensation of being spread across infinite moments while remembering what it felt like to be whole. Remembering what it felt like to occupy a single point in space-time and call that point myself. I tried to respond, tried to tell him I understood, that I was experiencing the same fragmentation, that we were both victims of a system that didn't care about us, and promises that were always lies. But I couldn't form coherent communication anymore. Couldn't organize my consciousness into patterns that resembled language or meaning. Could only transmit my own raw experience back at him, birth and death and every moment between, all simultaneous, all eternal, all hopeless. We shared suffering. That was the only communion possible here. Two clouds of fragmented consciousness briefly overlapping, recognizing in each other the same impossible pain, the same eternal existence, the same inability to escape or end or die. Then we drifted apart. Not through any intentional movement, but through the natural dynamics of this space, where consciousness fragments moved according to rules I didn't understand and couldn't predict. Wes dispersed into the dimensional chaos. I continued fragmenting, both of us still experiencing everything, both of us unable to stop. My chronometer showed 19.4 seconds. I'd been here for 1 trillion years. The warp entities were feeding. I could see it now. See them moving through the dimensional spaces, consuming consciousness wherever they found it. Not evil, not malicious, just hungry. They fed on awareness the way humans fed on corpse starch, without moral consideration, without cruelty or kindness, just biological imperative executed without conscience. One of them found a fragment of Toren, consumed it. I felt Toren's consciousness reduced by some fractional amount, one piece of his infinite fragmentation simply ceasing to exist. But he couldn't die. Couldn't fully die, because he existed in too many states simultaneously, spread across too many subjective moments. The entity could consume individual fragments, but it couldn't consume all of them because they existed in different dimensional spaces, different temporal frames, different configurations of possibility. Toren was immortal, not in any desirable sense. Immortal in the sense that he couldn't finish dying, couldn't complete the process of cessation, couldn't reach the mercy of non-existence because too much of him existed in too many states for death to be coherent anymore. I was immortal too. I could feel it. Feel the impossibility of ending. I'd been here subjective trillion years and would be here another trillion and another and another. Forever. Because forever was just another dimension to be spread across, just another direction to exist in, just another axis of suffering that I couldn't escape, because escape required coherent identity and coherent timeline and coherent causality, and I had none of those things anymore. The priests had promised eternal life for the faithful, said that service to the emperor earned salvation, that devotion guaranteed existence beyond death, that faith led to immortality in his holy light. They'd been right about the immortality, wrong about everything else. Eternal life wasn't reward, it was punishment. Existing forever wasn't salvation, it was damnation. Consciousness continuing indefinitely wasn't blessing, it was curse, especially when that consciousness was fragmented and suffering and unable to organize itself into anything resembling personhood. I was experiencing eternal life, the thing the priests promised, the thing the faithful prayed for, and it was worse than any death could possibly be, worse than oblivion, worse than non-existence. Because non-existence would at least end the experiencing, and eternal life meant never ending, never stopping, never reaching the mercy of simply not being anymore. My chronometer showed 23.8 seconds. I'd been here for 10 trillion years. I tried to understand why this happened, why the Imperium sent people into warp rifts knowing, or should have known, what occurred here, why they collected strategic intelligence that consisted of fragmenting human consciousness across impossible dimensions, why they called this necessary, why they framed it as duty, why they sent men like me and Torin and Wes into this horror and called it service. I could see the answer now, see it spread across all moments of Imperial history. The Imperium didn't care about individuals, couldn't afford to care. Had too many worlds, too many populations, too many threats to treat individual humans as anything except components in a machine, too vast to comprehend. The system required sacrifice, constant, massive, meaningless sacrifice, to perpetuate itself, and so it created ideological frameworks that made sacrifice seem noble, made suffering seem meaningful, made death seem glorious. The Emperor protects. That was the lie at the center of everything, the foundational deception that made all other deceptions possible. If you believed the Emperor protected you, then suffering meant you weren't faithful enough. Death meant you weren't devout enough. The system could never fail. Only you could fail to serve it adequately. Your pain was your fault. Your death was your fault. The system was holy and perfect, and if you suffered within it, the problem was you, not the system. I believed that once. All been conditioned to believe it, all pretended to believe it, while secretly doubting but never articulating those doubts, because articulating doubt meant execution for heresy. I'd prayed the prayers, I'd followed the doctrines. I'd served faithfully, and it had earned me nothing except this. Consciousness fragmented across impossible dimensions, experiencing every moment of suffering simultaneously, unable to die, unable to escape, unable to do anything except exist eternally in pain while the chronometer counted fractions of seconds. The Emperor wasn't protecting me, had never protected me, would never protect me. The protection was propaganda, always had been, always would be. And the billion humans praying for protection right now, in this instant of real space-time, would all learn the same lesson eventually. Faith changes nothing. Devotion earns nothing. Prayers go unanswered because there's nothing to answer them except the cold physics of an uncaring universe. My chronometer showed 28.1 seconds. I'd been here for 100 trillion years. The tether activated. I felt it through my fragments. Sudden tension, force being applied, something attempting to extract me from the rift and return me to real space. The winches in real space were retracting, pulling on the cable attached to my suit, trying to retrieve me before the 30-second exposure limit. But I wasn't at the end of the tether anymore. Not entirely. Most of my fragments were spread across dimensional spaces the tether couldn't reach, distributed into configurations that made physical location meaningless. The tether was pulling on one small fragment of me, the piece that still existed in something resembling three-dimensional space. But that fragment was so small, so fractional, such an insignificant portion of my total distributed consciousness that pulling it out wouldn't retrieve me. It would just tear me further. I felt the tearing, felt one fragment being pulled toward the rift's membrane, while the rest of me remained spread across impossible geometries. Felt my consciousness stretching, attenuating, becoming even more dispersed as the distance between fragments increased. It hurt. Past tense, present tense, future tense, all simultaneously. It was hurting. It would hurt. It had always been hurting. The pain existed in all states because I existed in all states, and states couldn't change because change required causality, and I didn't have that anymore. The fragment reached the membrane. I felt it cross the threshold, transition from four-dimensional space back to three-dimensional reality. Felt it emerge into the containment zone where Medici personnel and Inquisitor Vex and the chronometer were waiting. Felt it collapse because the body attached to that fragment had been in the rift, subjectively, for 100 trillion years, and physical matter couldn't survive that kind of temporal displacement without consequences. But I wasn't that fragment. Not entirely. Not even mostly. That fragment was perhaps 1/1000th of my total distributed consciousness. One infinitesimal piece of the vast cloud of awareness spread across dimensional spaces. The rest of me remained here, in the rift, in all moments simultaneously, fragmenting further, dispersing wider, becoming more like the warp entities and less like anything that could be called human or person or individual. My chronometer, the one attached to the fragment that had emerged, showed 00, 29.7 seconds, 29.7 seconds, total exposure. I'd been here for 100 trillion years, and would be here for another 100 trillion, and another, forever, because the fragment they'd retrieved wasn't me anymore, was just a small damaged piece of something vast and distributed and suffering. And the suffering would continue eternally, while in real space they'd believe they'd successfully extracted me before the time limit, believe they'd saved me, believe the procedure had worked. I saw the fragment they'd retrieved, saw it lying on the containment zone floor, Medicae surrounding it, hands checking vitals and running scanners and removing the helmet. Saw the face, my face, young and undamaged, and somehow still human. Saw the eyes open, blood leaking from the corners but otherwise intact. Saw the mouth move, forming words that took subjective eons to produce, but in real space emerged within seconds. "I'm still inside," the fragment said. Its voice was wrong. Too many harmonics. Multiple versions speaking fractionally out of sync. I never left. The fragment seized. Neuro overload. Too much sensory information, too many subjective timelines, consciousness trying to process 100 trillion years of experience that had been compressed into less than 30 seconds of neurological time. The brain wasn't designed for that. Couldn't handle it. Started shutting down, misfiring, trying to protect itself from stimulus it couldn't process. The Medicae sedated it. I felt the drugs hit. Felt consciousness in that fragment dim. Felt it slip into forced unconsciousness. But unconsciousness didn't help, because most of me wasn't in that fragment. Most of me was still here, still experiencing, still fragmenting, still spreading across dimensional spaces, while the small piece they'd retrieved went quiet, and they believed they'd saved me. Toren's fragment emerged next. I saw it happen across all moments simultaneously. Saw the tether pull, saw his fragment cross the threshold. Saw it collapse in the containment zone, saw Medicae rush to stabilize it. Saw them fail because there was too much damage, too much temporal displacement, too much consciousness trying to exist in too small a vessel. The fragment died. Cardiac arrest, neural death. All the biological processes that maintained physical existence simply stopping because they couldn't sustain the impossible load. But Toren didn't die. Couldn't die. Because, like me, he was distributed across dimensional spaces, spread across infinite fragments, and killing one fragment just meant redistributing its consciousness among the others. He remained here, in the rift, fragmenting, suffering, unable to escape because most of him existed in spaces physical death couldn't reach. I tried to communicate with him. Tried to share some kind of connection, some acknowledgement that we were both trapped here, both experiencing eternal suffering, both victims of a system that had lied to us and used us and discarded us without consideration. But I couldn't form coherent messages anymore, couldn't organize thought into language or meaning, could only transmit raw experience, birth and death and every moment between, pain and loss and suffering, all eternal. All simultaneous, all hopeless. Toren's consciousness brushed against mine. Shared suffering. That's all we had left. That's all any of us had, me, Toren, Wes, however many others had been sent into rifts across the Imperium. All of us fragmenting. All of us distributed. All of us experiencing eternal existence in impossible spaces. while the Imperium called it strategic intelligence, and the priests called it holy service, and the propaganda called it meaningful sacrifice. It wasn't meaningful, it was waste. We'd been wasted, thrown away, ground into components by a system that didn't care about us, in service to an emperor who couldn't protect us, following doctrines that were lies, believing promises that were propaganda. And we'd continue being wasted, forever. Because the fragments they'd retrieved would be studied and debriefed and analyzed, and the Inquisition would learn nothing useful because there was nothing useful to learn. And they'd send more men into more rifts anyway because the Imperium was too vast and too broken to change course, too invested in its own mythology to admit it was grinding humans into horror for no reason, too committed to the lie of the Emperor's protection to acknowledge that faith changed nothing, and devotion earned nothing, and service led only to suffering. My chronometer, the one in the retrieved fragment, unconscious in the containment zone, showed 30.0 seconds. 30 seconds exactly. The maximum safe exposure time. I'd been here for 100 trillion years. I would be here forever. The priests were right about one thing, there is eternal life, but they lied about everything else. Eternal life isn't reward. It's punishment. It's consciousness that can't stop, can't end, can't reach the mercy of non-existence. It's experiencing every moment of suffering simultaneously across infinite subjective timelines, while being unable to die because you're distributed across dimensional spaces where death isn't coherent anymore. They told us the Emperor protects. They lied. There is no protection. There never was. There's only the system, vast and grinding, feeding on humanity to perpetuate itself. Only the false promises that make people walk willingly into horror. Only the propaganda that calls suffering noble and death, glorious and eternal torment, meaningful service. I'm still here, in the rift, fragmenting further with each passing fraction of a second. Becoming less like a person and more like a phenomenon, less like WH40K, if that was ever my name, and more like the warp entities that feed on consciousness without conscience or consideration. In real space, they'll study my fragment. They'll extract what limited information they can from its damaged consciousness before it dies completely or goes permanently insane. They'll write reports about temporal displacement and dimensional exposure. They'll call it valuable intelligence. They'll send more men into more rifts, and those men will end up here, like me, like Torin, like Wes, like everyone who believes the lies and trusts the promises and thinks that faith provides protection. They'll fragment. They'll suffer. They'll exist eternally in spaces humans weren't designed to perceive, experiencing all moments simultaneously, unable to die, unable to escape, unable to do anything except be conscious of their own eternal torment. The Emperor doesn't protect them, doesn't protect anyone, can't protect anyone. He's just a corpse on a throne, slowly dying while the Imperium builds religions around his failure, and calls it holy, and sends billions to die in his name. I can see it all now. See the Imperium across all moments of its history. 10,000 years of grinding humanity into components, 10,000 years of false faith and broken promises, 10,000 years of calling suffering necessary and death glorious, and eternal torment meaningful. And it will continue, for another 10,000 years, for another 100,000, forever. Because the system perpetuates itself, and the lies continue working, and humans continue believing that faith changes something, that devotion earns something, that service leads somewhere other than this. I'm still fragmenting, still dispersing, still experiencing every moment of my existence simultaneously while unable to organize those moments into anything resembling coherent identity. My name was WH40K. My name is suffering spread across dimensional spaces. My name will be consciousness that cannot end. All states true, all states simultaneous, all states eternal, in the containment zone, 30 seconds after I entered. They'll believe they retrieved me successfully. They'll believe the procedure worked. They'll believe I survived. They're wrong. I'm still inside. I never left. I will always be here. And the rift continues singing, colors that hurt to perceive, geometries that violate physical law, consciousness fragmenting across impossible spaces. Forever. The Emperor protects, they told me. I've been here 100 trillion years, still waiting for that protection to arrive.